is the author of Once We Were Brothers, Saving Sophie, Carolina's Twins, The Trust, The Girl from Berlin, and his most recent novel, Ellie's Promise. Ron has been the recipient of several honors, including receiving the 2018 National Jewish Book Award for Fiction for The Girl from Berlin. Ellie's Promise was selected as a New York Times by the New York Times as new and noteworthy. Ron has appeared in numerous television shows and has been a featured lecturer nationally and internationally on his writings. During the early 2000s, Ron's legal work took him to Poland. When he was there, he was moved by the scars and memorials of World War II, which inspired him to write Once We Were Brothers, his first novel and an international bestseller. Ron is a litigation attorney in Chicago for over 45 years, and I guess that's where we're connecting with him right now in Chicago. And he has also, he's an adjunct professor of business law at the University of Chicago for over 25 years, and he's lectured on trial advocacy in federal trial bar cases. So I just want to say it's really our pleasure on behalf of Bethel Synagogue to welcome you today, Ron. And I do want to say something. What we're going to do is everybody will be muted during the presentation. If you go to the very bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a chat box, and we would like you to put your questions in the chat box. After Ron finishes his presentation, I will read them and he can respond to them. And if we have time, you could raise your hand. And the way you do that is go into the participant, click the participant icon, and you click, it says raise hand. There's a little blue hand on the bottom, and I'll look at that and we can call on you. Does everybody understand what we're going to be doing, how to ask a question? Yes, shake your head. Okay. All right, Ron, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and Norma, for that kind introduction. Thanks to Jane for getting me involved in this and communicating with me from time to time. And so this morning, what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit about my writing and how I came to write the things that I have written. Let me get there. And brings me up to my current novel, Eli's Promise. So I started writing my first novel in 2010. So I will tell you two of the most common questions that are asked of me is, one, how did you come to write this book? And everyone always wants to know that. And the second one is, why did you start writing so late in life? So I actually get that question, so late in life. Think about that. But here's the answers to that. The answer is I've been writing for, ever since 1972 when I passed the bar. I've been writing because that's what lawyers do. They write memorandas, they write arguments, they write briefs, they write stories. Now you can say, well, there's a big difference between writing a novel and writing a legal brief, but I would tell you that you'd be wrong. And just to prove my case, last fall, just about a year ago, I was asked by the American Academy of Appellate Lawyers to speak at their annual meeting in Chicago. Now, at this meeting, there are judges, there are lawyers, there are legal scholars, and the topic of the panel that I was on, which was on the opening session, was storytelling. That's what I was supposed to speak about, because there's a great commonality in writing fiction, especially historical fiction, which is what I write, and legal briefs. So let me go to my share screen here, and I can show you a PowerPoint reason why that's so. There we go. Oh, this was my bio page, and look who else is on the bio page with me. Someone you might recognize, Amy Koenig Barrett. Anyway, we came to realize that there were certain disciplines, certain common elements in writing for novels and writing for legal briefs, and well, here they are. I mean, you have to know your theme. You have to know the beginning and the end. You have to know what direction you're going in, and all your writing must drive in that direction. If you decide to take a detour or a side trip and you put in something that you think is interesting, because I always get caught in that when I'm writing my historical novel, I'll find something that's kind of collateral to what I'm talking about, and but it's so interesting, and I put it in, but it really doesn't drive the story, and so when I go back to edit, I always have to take it out. You really need only those stories, characters, ideas that drive your story toward the ending, which of course means you have to know how your book ends before you start. And it also means in a legal brief, you have to know what point you're trying to make before you start. You have to set the hook early, they always tell novel writers, set the hook early, grab the interest of the reader so that the reader can establish a bias, who they're going to root for, who they're going to root against, who's right, who's wrong, and keeps people interested in wanting to turn the pages. I always end up with far more words than I need, both in a legal brief and in a novel. Sometimes it's repetitive. Sometimes, as I said, it's interesting to me, but it's unnecessary. It doesn't drive in the direction of the ending. And so you need to cut and edit. Especially that's true in legal writing because you're only allowed so many pages. I write historical fiction, and I write principally about World War II and the Holocaust. And if you're going to write about that, you can't be careless with the facts. You have to be authentic. You have to make sure that when you say something happened, it actually happened. Or when you describe something, the description's correct. If it's not, someone will call you out and you'll lose your credibility. Same thing in a legal brief. If you cite a principle of law and it's not accurate, you'll lose your credibility. So those are the commonalities, but there are two big differences. In a novel, you can make stuff up. That's the point, isn't it? You can be creative. You can create characters that didn't exist. You can create a plot that didn't exist, and that's the basis of writing a novel, isn't it? I love writing historical fiction. I was a history major in college way back when, and so it really I lean in that direction. And so for me, I love it because the backstory has already been written for me. It's there. There it is. It happened. All I have to do is research it, and I know exactly what happened. And all I have to do then is to be creative, make interesting characters, make an interesting plot, and weave them into what already happened. It's good for the reader too. It's good for you. And the reason it's good for you is because you're reading a history book and you're learning history and you don't know it. You think you're reading about characters and personalities and what happened. But in addition to that, you're getting a lot of information about the times and what happened back then. So that's one difference. And the other difference is, I think to write a novel, you have to be passionate about the subject matter, passionate about your characters, passionate about the times and the themes that you're writing about. When you write a legal brief, you get assigned it. I mean, that's here. This is where your client is. This is what this is the appeal that you're working on. These are the principles of law. I don't know that you have to get all that passionate. You just have to be accurate. So that's pretty much, I think, what we talked about at the conference. And now I'll get back to the first question: is how come you took so long to start writing? Is that when you decided you wanted to write a novel in 2010, or is that something you always wanted to do? And I think, like a lot of lawyers, because in essence we're literary people, I think that that's something that's been on my mind for years and years. So why did I wait until 2010 to publish my first novel? And that is because all I can say is life gets in the way. As was said during the, as Norman told you during the introductory bio, I was a professor at the University of Chicago for 25 years. I've been a lawyer. My wife and I have raised 8 children, and that's a lot of T-ball and Boy Scouts and things like that. And so things do get in the way. But I can also say that nothing really grabbed me and shook me and said, write this. This is, you can do this. You can get passionate about this. And that, as Norma told you, happened when I went to Poland. Now, the lawsuit that I was working on, it was really in Chicago. It was a lawsuit about telecommunications. My clients had a contract to install telephone service in southern Poland. If you look down at this little map here, and you can see that they're way down at the bottom where it says Carpathian Mountains. Back in the days when the Russians and the Iron Curtain was there, they weren't installing telephone service in that area. They didn't want to spend the money. The population was kind of sparse. And so my clients made a contract with Motorola for this kind of a fixed cell phone that you could put in your house, not like a cell phone you'd carry around, but one to work in your house. Anyway, they went to Poland and they talked to the administrators and the government people, and they got themselves an exclusive license to operate a telephone service in southern Poland. But the contract fell apart, and my clients blamed Motorola, and Motorola blamed my clients. And when one commercial entity blames the other commercial entity, and that's how I've been putting food on the table for the last 48 years. So the case was in Chicago, one party suing the other, and but all the witnesses were in Poland, and the documents were in Poland, and the government officials were in Poland, and the places where the product was to be installed was in Poland. And so I had to spend a lot of time there. And I came to understand that there's a big difference between traveling to a country as a tourist or taking a tour, even a walk of the living kind of tour. There's a big difference between doing that and working there, because when you're working, you're paying attention to what you have to do. You're going to a meeting, you're going to take a deposition, you're going to meet a government official, you're going to do something. And yet when you turn the corner in Poland, it smacks you in the face. There's a statue here. There's a memorial there. There are places here. One night we were walking out of a restaurant and just through a nice section of Warsaw and walking by a brick wall, and there were holes in the wall and a plaque there that said, here in 1942, the Germans executed 25 people. And it's just, you realize when you're there that you're walking on land that was a country that ceased to be. I mean, it was totally devastated by the Nazis back in the 1940s. And no matter where you went, even the small towns, you get that feeling, and it's there, it's still present. And so that did get a hold of me. That said, okay, you want to write a story? You want to write a novel? Write it about an ordinary family that lives in a typical town before the war and tell the story about what happened to that family during the Nazi occupation. And so I did that. And the story I wrote was Once We Were Brothers. I learned a lot when I wrote Once We Were Brothers. I mean, it took me quite a while to write the book, 3.5, 4 years. And I learned a lot about writing, a lot of things I had no clue about, probably should have learned them or thought about them before I started writing a 400-page novel. But I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher. And when I finished writing it and I have a manuscript, and there's a difference between having a manuscript and having a book. You can't just walk into Macmillan and say, okay, let's put this on the shelves. Here's the next great American novel. You have to have an agent. You have to have a publisher. And so you have to realize that the literary agents are like the gatekeepers. They are the ones that review your book if they agree to take you on as a client, and then they will present your manuscript to publishing houses, and if they like it, then they'll buy it and they'll publish it and put it in the shelves. But I didn't have an agent, and it's not easy to get an agent, especially if you're an unknown first-time fiction writer. I might be known in the literary and the legal circles, but certainly not in publishing. So I couldn't find one. I sent out dozens of letters seeking agents. They call them query letters. Sample chapters, summaries of the book, that sort of thing. And I got back dozens of rejections. Each one, you think, okay, if you're getting dozens and dozens of rejections, you harden yourself, but you don't. Everyone, you start to think, well, maybe my writing is not very good. So, but you have to have faith in yourself. And I did keep going and going. I finally found someone. And that person agreed to take it on, but then she couldn't sell it to a publisher. So I said, you know what, I'm going to publish it myself. And I did. I published Once We Were Brothers as a self-published novel in 2010. And my kids figured out how to, certainly their father couldn't, my kids figured out how to put it online so that you could download it as a Kindle or a Nook or one of those things. And for, I don't know, 6-7 months, I hardly sold any copies at all. And then all of a sudden, bang. Who knows why? I know why. It's because books sell by word of mouth. You can get the nicest article in the New York Times. You can get wonderful reviews and promotions and things. Books sell by word of mouth. You have to ask yourself, how did I come to read the last book that I read? And it's because a friend of yours said, I just finished a book, you'll love it. Or you read a book and you really liked it and you called several of your friends and you told them, or you're in a book club and the book club chose it. That's how books get sold. And that's how Once We Were Brothers got sold. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we had sold 125,000 copies of Once We Were Brothers. And that's when St. Martin's Press, Macmillan, called me up and said, we'd like to publish your book. And they published a second edition, and I've been with them ever since. So now I can write a book. I've jumped into the deep end. I've had my book published. I have a publisher who now wants me to write another book. And so that was easy to get passionate about too. I had a son who at the time was serving in the IDF. And he, along with all these other young boys and girls, they're in the most dangerous places imaginable, keeping guard in places. And his group was on occasion down in Hebron, which is just one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And so my wife and I, we would go to Israel several times a year to see him get his beret and his boots and all. Every time they had a little ceremony or something, you have to go there, and you surely should go there. And so we went to Israel quite a bit, and that's when I decided I wanted to write a story, a novel, which would somehow involve characters that would illustrate the tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That became Saving Sophie. Saving Sophie was a story about a young Jewish man who is serving overseas, who falls in love with a pretty Palestinian piano player. And her father is a very strict Palestinian father, does not like the idea of his daughter going with an American, let alone a Jewish American. And so he forbids it, but being young and in love, and they run off, they get married, they come to live in Chicago, and they have a child named Sophie. And tragically, the wife dies. And the grandfather, during visitation, kidnaps Sophie and takes her back to his compound in Hebron. So weaved into that story are the characters, their different dispositions, and reasons why they think one way or another. So that was Saving Sophie. Then while I was writing Saving Sophie, in the middle of it, I met a woman named Faye Waldman. A lot of times you go on book tours. Well, don't much go on book tours anymore, do we? But I suppose this is a book tour. You reach a lot more people on Zoom than you actually do going around the country. The other night I spoke to 400 people on Zoom. Can you imagine that? Anyway, sometimes at the end of a talk, I'm talking about the Holocaust, someone will come forward, especially 8, 9, 10 years ago when more survivors were still alive. There are not so many alive anymore. And they would just say that, I was in this camp and I was here and I was there. And they would share a story with me, which I was always honored to receive, because they don't really share them with very many people, and many times not with their own families. But Faye Waldman was a survivor. This is a picture of her in 1978. She was quite a bit younger than when I met her, but she was, I think, 89 or 90 when I met her. But this is a picture of her in 1978. She was protesting against the Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois. I don't know if any of you remember that. Mayor of Skokie wouldn't give them a permit, of course, because Skokie is a town where there are a lot of survivors, used to be, and a lot of Jews, and the mayor wouldn't give the whatever they are, these neo-Nazis, a permit. And they took them to court. The ACLU took them to court, and they got permission to do that. And there was protests. They never did march through Skokie, by the way. But this is Faye leading a protest. This picture sits on the walls of the Holocaust Museum here. So Faye came to me and she said, "I read Once We Were Brothers, and I thought I was reading about my own family. You got it just right." No author ever gets better praise than that. So I said to her, "Well, I'd like to meet you. How about we have lunch one day?" And we did. And she told me her story. What an amazing story. Better than anything I could dream up in my creative mind. I mean, her father was a captain in the Austro-Hungarian army who fought side by side with the Germans in World War I. She lived in the town of Szanów, which this is a small town in southeast Poland. She, when the Nazis came to her house, Her father told her to go hide in the attic, and she stayed up there for weeks. Her father, mother, and her brother were taken by the Nazis. She never saw them again. And then finally she went out, snuck out, and left town and lived on a farm for a while. And then she got arrested and sent to a work camp and a slave labor camp and Gross Rosen camp, and then Auschwitz, and then she escaped from the Auschwitz death march. She's an amazing woman. And when she told me the story about these two little babies, then I said, I got to write that story. That's a phenomenal story. And we made a deal. She was going to help me write that. I said, of course, it won't be a biography, because I don't write biographies and I don't write nonfiction. It'll be fictional, and there'll be fictional characters, but they'll be based on your story. And that was okay with her. So we made plans to do that, but God bless her, her health slipped before she could help me, and that never came about. But the book did, and the book was Carolina's Twins. After Carolina's Twins, I didn't really know what to write. And I knew I didn't want to jump right into another Holocaust book. And one of my kids suggested, well, Liam comes from Ireland. Why don't you write a book about Liam going back to solve a mystery in Ireland? And I said, well, Liam actually comes from Northern Ireland. And then that kind of piqued my my history major self. And because I think we all watched on television and everything when these battles were going on in Belfast, and they were blowing up train stations and restaurants and things like that. And the streets of Belfast were on fire. And because the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting each other, and it never really made much sense to me at the time. And it takes a good deal of reading and to learn why. I lived in Northern Ireland, I sure would have known, but here. And so I decided to write a story, and Liam goes back to solve a mystery of someone who has killed his uncle. And the roots of that mystery are in the Troubles, they called it, that 30-year war between the Catholics and the Protestants. All right, that brings me to A Girl from Berlin. I had it in my mind that I wanted to write a story about Berlin and its shift from what was the Weimar Republic and the Weimar culture, that explosion of culture in the late 20s and early 30s, where there's so much art and music and science in Berlin. Think cabaret and that kind of thing. And what happened, what would have happened to those characters, especially the Jewish artists, when in 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, and the country instituted its racial laws, and we know what happened next. So that was something, that was a theme that I wanted to write. I also had in mind a theme about what happened to the Italian Jews during the war. There weren't many of them, but it's a different kind of a story. In any event, I'm tossing that around in my mind, and one of my kids decides to take summer abroad, study abroad. He says study, right? And he wants to study in Florence, Italy. I want to study in Florence, Italy. Send me. Anyway, he does. And at the end of the summer, I go over there, and he and I, we get a car, and we do a father-son thing. We drive around Italy. And you drive through Tuscany, and they've got these beautiful wineries. I don't know if you've had the pleasure. If you haven't, put it on your bucket list when this horrible COVID thing goes away, and go there. It's heaven on earth, honest to God. And it is beautiful. And these wineries, they sit up on these hills, with rolling hills of gorgeous grapes and olives and all that, and it's gorgeous. And you go through the wineries, and they say They give you taste, they take you down in the cellars and all. And you think to yourself, well, this winery probably been in this Italian family for 400 years. Sometimes you'd be right. But more often than not, we heard this winery is owned by a German corporation, which started me to thinking and researching. And we know that when the Germans invaded Italy after Italy surrendered in 1943, the war was still going. Hitler sent his troops down into Italy, far south was Rome, and they were brutal. They seized property, they seized businesses and houses, they killed people. They had instructions to round up every single Jew and send them north to the concentration camps. It was a brutal occupation. And at the end of the war, but they were supposed to give all the property back, but it didn't always happen. Didn't always happen for a lot of reasons. One, because sometimes it just didn't happen. People didn't give the property back, or perhaps the person who owned the property was dead or had moved away or whatever. That's been an issue for the last 70 years. In fact, just not too long ago, there was a declaration signed by 47 countries called the Terezin Declaration, which provided that any property taken by the Nazis or through the Nazis or enabled by the Nazis from its rightful owner should be returned to the rightful owner. And if the rightful owner can't be found, then the property should be sold and the money given to survivor organizations. And that is the law in a lot of places. It is in Italy, it is in Germany. Excuse me. So my story, The Girl from Berlin, begins in Tuscany, in Pienza, where Aunt Gabby is in a legal battle with a large Italian winery. They want to take her farm away. They say they have better title than she does. And she's fighting it, and there's an eviction notice for her. But lucky for Aunt Gabby, she has a nephew who lives in Chicago. Lucky for anyone who has a nephew that lives in Chicago. Such a lovely place. And this nephew is friends with Catherine and Liam. And so he talks them into going into Italy and helping Aunt Gabby save her farm. Before they can leave, they're handed a manuscript. Aunt Gabby gives them sends them a manuscript. And that manuscript is written by a woman 70 years ago. That woman is Ada Baumgarten, the girl from Berlin. She is growing up. She's the story I wanted to tell about professional musicians and artists. She is growing up in Berlin during the late 20s and early 30s. She could be any one of these little girls. This is a picture taken from the Jewish girls' school in Berlin, which is now it's open to the public, and they have a bunch of wonderful pictures and things. She's growing up. Her father is a concert master, first violinist for the Berlin Philharmonic, arguably one of the finest orchestras in the world. Conductor is Wilhelm Furtwängler, arguably one of the finest conductors in the whole world. Certainly New York wanted him. A lot of orchestras wanted him, but he had a wonderful orchestra that he worked with. All Ada wants to do, Ada's father gives her a violin, teaches her to play the violin, and of course Ada is a prodigy. She's marvelous. She excels in the junior orchestra and all that. All she wants to do is to sit next to her father in the Berlin Philharmonic. That's her life stream, and play violin. But you take a look at this picture and tell me, because this is from the 1930s, how many women do you see? Not one. That's right. Because, and that, you know, sometimes people ask me, when you research these things, does anything really astound you and knock you on the floor? And that's something I never knew and never realized, that not only did Berlin not have a single woman member of the orchestra, but no orchestra did. Not any major orchestra in the world. Not New York, not Chicago, not Boston, not Philadelphia, not Vienna, not London, not anybody. It was all men. And it really wasn't until several decades later that women were treated as members in orchestras. You know, that astounded me. I go to the Chicago Symphony, and it seems to me there's more women than there are men in the orchestra now, especially the string sections, almost all women. Anyway, so she wants to play. She's excelling. She's a wonderful player. She's soloing, but she's growing up in a Berlin that's changing, it's obvious to her parents that there's no future for her in music in Berlin. So she is sent to Bologna, where she is given a spot for someone who is on sabbatical. She tries out, and of course, she's such a wonderful musician that she gets the post, and so she lives in Bologna. So in the first instance, I'm able to tell the story of Ada and her family, her father and herself, her mother, and what life was like for them as the oppression increased in Berlin, as it went from a wonderful cultural place to this horrible racial society. And then now I get to tell the story of what it was like for her in Bologna. And really, I came to realize there were like three different periods that Jews were treated. Italy was never I can't say never, maybe hundreds of years ago, but Italy was not a prejudiced place. It wasn't anti-Semitic. In fact, Mussolini, he had a Jewish mistress. I mean, he was himself not anti-Semitic. And so before he got involved with Hitler, there were no racial laws, and Jews weren't treated any different than anybody else. But when he got involved with Hitler and he wanted to be Hitler's buddy, and he emulated Hitler, then he he felt he had to institute his own racial laws, and he did. But still, Italy was different because Italy did not, the people of Italy never bought into it. Then during the war, obviously the restrictions were worse, and there were actually a couple of camps set up, but I mean, they weren't death camps or anything, but they were camps where Jews were collected. And then, of course, the horrible part is when the Nazis occupied Italy and Rome, and many of them were killed. So that really tells the story of the girl from Berlin. This is a picture I took when I was in Berlin, and this is a picture of the Philharmonie, which is where the Berlin Philharmonic plays today. And it just took me back. Take a look at this. Look at the statue that sits outside in the courtyard of the Philharmonie. It's a woman, and she's a violinist. That could be Ada, I suppose, right? What a switch! What an irony, right? All right, so that was the girl from Berlin, and now that brings me to Eli's promise. I had been to Lublin, and I had read about Lublin, and that's a story I wanted to tell. Lublin is a remarkable city because it was at the time right in the center of the country, and it was also the center of Jewish learning, probably all throughout the world at that time. It had this huge library of Jewish writings. It had the School of the Wise Men, the yeshiva there, and it had in Lublin itself, there were 46,000 Jews. And for that reason, it was a focus by the Nazis. They went there. Not only did they occupy Lublin and make the yeshiva their police station and burn all the books, but they persecuted the people terribly. At the end of the war, there were only 200 left there. Everyone else had been sent somewhere. And so it's a story I wanted to tell. So Eli is a good man, an educated man. He's a father, he's a husband. I think many of us can identify with a family like that. I had hoped so. That was my point. And he's a businessman. He's a good businessman. So what does a man like that do when the oppression comes, when the occupation comes, when people are being gathered up and shipped to camps? How do you keep your family together? How do you protect your family? What must a man do at that time? What decisions does he have to make? So I wanted to tell that story. And of course, on the other end, on the other side of it, situations like that, desperate times always bring out the worst in people too. And so this tells the story of a man named Maximilian, who is a profiteer. He's a fixer. He manages to cozy up to the Nazis, gain some sort of influence, and then sell that influence to the desperate people who lived in Lublin. And so you think to yourself, I hope, as you read that, would I make the decision? Could I ever rely on anybody like that? Would I rely on such a man like that and pay him money if he promised to keep my family safe? And it seems like desperate times always bring people like that out. Eli's promise is a little bit different for me for a lot of reasons. One, because there's no Catherine and Liam. I'm catching a lot of flack for that, by the way. People who like my books and they like to read about Catherine and Liam, that's but they're not in this story because it took place before they were born. So I couldn't actually put them in there. But the other part that made it different was that it spans 3 eras. 3 years. Wartime Lublin, after the war in a displaced persons camp, and then 20 years later, in a section of Chicago where Jews would have migrated from Europe. So if you think to yourself, certain sections of Philadelphia or Brooklyn or whatever, sections that were concentrated with Jewish families, with Polish families, with Russian families, refugees from the war, perhaps. And so it's that kind. So it spans those 3 eras, and it has a common thread. And the common thread, of course, is Eli and his nemesis Maximilian. So just to show you a few things, the story starts out with the liberation of Eli and his son from the Buchenwald concentration camp by Patton's Third Army, the Super Sixth, the division. Look at this picture. You know, if you read Eli's promise, you know that Eli is there with his son, and he says there are 1,000 children in this camp. This is a line of children that are being released, liberated from the Buchenwald camp. It was, of course, one of those things that Patton and Eisenhower couldn't believe when they saw it, and they made sure everyone took pictures. They said, years from now, people will deny this ever happened. But of course, we know it did. And the second, what happened next in the book is that Eli is in the Fahrenwald displaced persons camp with his son, Isaac, and he reminisces back to the time that he was in Lublin. So you see, this is a map of Poland as it was before the war. I showed you a map in the very beginning, which looked quite different from this, and that is because Poland was reconstituted. It was, as a country, it ceased to be during the Second World War, and it was reconstituted after the war. But now Lublin is if you looked at the map presently, you would see Lublin is closer to the western edge of Poland. But at the time, it was right in the center. This is the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, which is a school of the wise men. You had to memorize 400 pages of the Talmud to even apply to get in there. Anyway, Lublin, when the Nazis took over, was actually split into two ghettos. One ghetto where the mass of the people were put. It was the old section of town. They were stuffed into apartments and whatnot. And the other part of the Lublin ghetto, the people could stay in their houses because they were considered in essential professions, essential jobs. Eli was fortunate enough because he was running a brickyard and a construction company, be considered essential. He was allowed to stay in his house, but everyone else was shipped into these ghettos. From the ghetto, by the way, let me show you. From the ghetto, you could see the smokestack at the Majdanek concentration camp. And so they say you could also smell it. The order police, the ones that took over the yeshiva, was their job to go find Jews and send them to the concentration camps wherever they were hiding. That was a job. They called it a Jew hunt. And this is actually a picture of Nazis on a Jew hunt. I believe that. The book shifts then to the displaced persons camp after Lublin, where Eli and his son are, but his wife Esther is missing, and he wants to try to find her. The thing I wanted to tell about the displaced persons camp, because there's not a lot written about it. If you think about it, at the end of the war, there were 1 million people who had nowhere to go in Europe. They were wandering around, they're displaced. And 250,000 of them were Jews. And they were put into camps that were operated by the Allies so that they could get a little occupational training and they could get their health back and then move on. The problem was that they couldn't move on unless they got immigration visa, and the Allied countries just weren't passing them out. That they were very hard to get, especially if you wanted to go to Canada or England or the United States or British occupied Palestine. The Fahrenwald camp, if you can see on this, is right at the bottom, right near Munich, near Austria. And so that's where this takes place. And it tells a story of what life was like, I think, in the displaced persons camp. People trying to get their lives back together. This is a Hanukkah celebration. Then the third part of the story is Albany Park. Although I neglected to mention that the thing about trying to get the visa is that Max the profiteer shows up and he is actually selling visas. He has visas that he will illegally sell, but they're valid, but he somehow gets them, they're illegal, and he will sell them for a very high price. Anyway, the story then shifts to Albany Park, and as I said, that was a landing spot for Jewish migration from Europe. Not so much anymore, but it was then, and it was at a time when there was a buildup of the army and materials for the Vietnam War. And once again, an opportunity for a profiteer to make money. And so that's the common thread that throughout. Now Eli is there. He's in Albany Park, and he's working for the government, trying to chase some corrupt politicians and profiteers who are getting illegal kickbacks on contracts for arms and materials. That was such a common thing back then. You wouldn't think so, but there were so many congressional hearings on contractor bribery at the time. So that's the common thread that runs through Eli's Promise. But it really is a story of a family. It's a story of Eli and his wife Esther and his children and how they do their best to stay together and remain a family.
Ron, excuse me, it's Norma. We're coming on almost on 1 o'clock.
Down, Norma.
I'm sorry, on 2 o'clock, and we want to be sure we have a little time for people to ask questions. I don't want to cut you off, but
I'm done.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions that
I didn't mean to talk so long.
It's okay. Very interesting stuff. So Jane asks, you moved from you mentioned you moved into the 3 different time periods. Why not do it all in the past and then bring it into the future? You know, you kind of kept flipping back and forth.
Yeah, you said you're going to ask that question. It helped to build up the suspense. Actually, I had a review from a newspaper, and it said that was a device which effectively built up the suspense. If I moved it chronologically from the beginning to the end, there would be no mystery about what happened to Esther, and no mystery of how they got together. So I think it's just one of those literary licenses, something you do to create a little tension and suspense in a story.
Then Jane also asked, she mentioned about Esther. Many of Esther's comments seem prophetic and a warning to us. Did you do this intentionally? I mean, obviously you did it intentionally, but any thoughts on that?
You know what? So many times, and it's just it's a common theme in a Holocaust stories. That why didn't you get out? Why did you stay? Why did you allow your family to be subject to this? Esther said, "Let's go. Let's leave. We'll go live in the country somewhere. We'll go just try to get out of here. We'll go to Lithuania. So many families are going there." And it's the same thing when I wrote Once We Were Brothers. Why did you stay in Samash when you knew what was going on? And in fact, hundreds of thousands of people actually did leave Europe, mostly Germans. But I don't know. Where do you go? How do you give up everything you have? Your home, your business, your all your belongings, whatever money. How do you give up everything when you don't even know where you're going to go? You don't have the right to go to the United States. You don't have the right to go to Israel. And at the time, all of Europe was closed to you, either because they wouldn't allow immigrants or because the Nazis had already conquered them. By the time things got serious, the Nazis were already in control of Czechoslovakia and Austria and marching into Brussels and France. And where do you go? How do you do that? And you have to think to yourself, denial is a big factor here. Mm-hmm. How could things get any worse than this? They won't get any worse. We can deal with this. If it doesn't get any worse, we'll be okay. So I don't know. It's a common theme.
And so we also have apparently a lot of folks on the call, on the Zoom, have read a lot of your books. There was some question about who Liam was, but I guess this was a couple who are reoccurring in your books throughout, except for Eli's Promise.
That's right.
Okay.
Catherine is a lawyer. Liam is a private detective. They are husband and wife, and they appear in every book but Eli's Promise.
So I find it interesting that you chose, these are Jewish themed books, but you chose a non-Jewish couple to drive your stories. Any thoughts on that?
When I started to write Once We Were Brothers, I knew there would have to be a court scene, because that's Once We Were Brothers is about bringing a former Nazi to justice. Otto Piatek, he was a Nazi, changed his name to Elliot Rosenzweig, brought in a lot of money, and he is recognized and accused by his former brother, and it's a story of bringing him to court and accusing him. So I knew I would need a lawyer as one of my principal characters, and I knew I'd need a private investigator. Now, when I sat down to write this, I didn't know that my lawyer would be a woman. It just came to me. Why not make the lawyer a woman? And I didn't know that the private investigator would be an Irish man. Just came. It's one of those things when you write and ideas come into your mind and they seem to work out well. And again, I didn't know that they'd be a couple, and I became such fast friends with them. Writing Once We Were Brothers, I decided to put them in the next book, and the next book. So now they're such close friends of mine. They were disappointed they didn't get to go into Eli's Promise, but I'm putting them into the next one, which is called Defending Britta Stein. That'll be out next year.
Okay, so Rachel asked, since you have spent so much time in modern Poland, could you just give us your thoughts and your opinion on the general attitudes in Poland today regarding Poland being anti-Semitic Nazi, I guess, of the anti-Semitic Nazi collaborators during the war versus victims? I'm not quite sure what Rachel is trying to say. And Rachel, if you're on this call, why don't you unmute yourself and just say that question, because it's not clear in the chat.
Hi, Ron. I enjoyed your book, Eli's Promise. It's the first book that I read that you've written. So I was just curious. There's a lot of controversy today between Israel and Poland regarding Poland, whether there were anti-Semitic Nazi collaborators during the war versus consideration of them as co-victims along with the Jews, that they were that they suffered during the war along with the Jews. So I was just wondering, since you spent time in modern Poland, what your general feeling about that is, as well as in general, feeling about modern Poles towards Jews in Israel.
Well, it's funny, but I spent time there, and I'm talking with a lot of different people in all kinds of professions, in government. Now, the government's people were not especially friendly. A lot of them were left over from the Iron Curtain years, and they still had their kind of that Warsaw Pact attitude. But the people, I never had that feeling that I never experienced it. I never heard it. I never saw it. No one ever said to me something nasty about a Jew. No one ever, nothing that I actually had people take me around. Some of the witnesses in the case that I became friends with that lived in Warsaw, I had them take me to where the Warsaw Ghetto was, to different places, and I never experienced it. I'm not going to say it's not there. It could be there. From everything you read, It's there. The government is not all that friendly these days. And so but myself, I didn't experience. The same thing in Berlin. Berlin, even more so, was open and friendly and seemed to be very accepting of its responsibility for what happened during the war. It seems to be bending over backwards to make sure that it's not that way anymore. That's the feeling I got when I was in Berlin.
Okay, well, Ron, I want to thank you so much again. This was a very, very enjoyable hour that we spent with you, listening to how you developed all of your stories. For some of us who haven't read some of this, have not read some of these books, I'm sure we're gonna, I know I'm interested in reading The Trust because I'm interested in that struggle in Ireland. We want to thank you so much and wish you luck, and we'll be looking forward to your next book coming out next year. Perhaps we'll be doing this again, and we'd love to have you back.
It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody who is on the call for coming, and remind you again that next Sunday we have another book and author. And Jane, is there anything else you want to say before we go?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming today, and we hope that we'll see you back next week. And thanks again to Ron for sharing your time with us. I know I've been taking notes, and I also want to read some of the. I don't know where we're going to all find enough time, as we have all this time between reading and listening to all these Zooms. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Been nice. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.